They call him Seatin, the man of legends.
Good day, audience, and welcome to Am I Ready for Raids, which is going to be a guide covering Am I Ready for Raids, basically. So this is mainly aimed at the newer players to the game, so people who have recently reached level 60 and have kind of, done a few experts, maybe some chronicles, and are like, oh, I've heard about raids, how do I get into raids, what do I have to do? So in this video, I'm going to be explaining what the entry-level requirements are for raids, my personal suggestion to get into the raiding scene, and also a few pro hints and tips along the way. So raiding is basically like 20 or 10 or 20 man group content. There are 4 tier 1 raids, which we're mainly going to be focusing on today, and also 3 tier 2 raids, but we're really going to focus on the entry level tier 1 raids today and how you get into them, what are the requirements, etc. So I'm going to first off start by saying that if you're a dedicated tank, say if you're a player who likes to tank and only tank, you're going to have a pretty bad time getting into raids. I'm going to be pretty honest with you. The Storm Legion expansion has been out for about a year and a half, and everyone has pretty much a load of tank gear. Everybody that's been raiding and playing the game for about over 6 months has a shit ton of tank gear, and the sort of health that they have ranges from about 70k to 90k, and you're not going to be able to get really above 60k until you sort of start raiding content and getting the gear via then. So if you're looking to burst into the raiding scene as a tank, unless you previously have like a large group of people, or you've got a very supportive guild, it's usually going to be a very bad idea. Although the fights don't require this much gear, a lot of people just will frown upon or quickly shrug off a tank that has sort of around 50 to 40k, which is kind of the entry level health that you have when you have 400 toughness. So we're not going to really go down the route of tanking today. We're going to mainly focus on healing and DPS, which are the 2 routes that if you want to get into raiding without a very supportive guild, or if you want to join into pug raiding, are the 2 routes that you'll initially want to go down. Now, for DPS and healing, you have one requirement to get into tier 1 raiding, and that is essentially 400 hit. That's the only requirement physically in the game stopping you from getting into the raids. Like, if you go in with less than 400 hit, then you will not be able to hit or deal damage to anything. And a lot of the healing specs revolve around you, for example, damaging the boss to be effective. For example, Warden, you have to use Geyser to damage the boss, and Chloromancer, you have to use damage to heal. So generally, if you're below 400 hit, then you are going to have a bad time in raids, and it also kind of reflects on your gear a bit. Now, hit is very, very easy to get. It comes from a variety of sources. So it comes from your rings, it comes from your neck, it comes from your weapons, and it comes from your head, and it comes from your gloves. Now, basically, both of the rings and also the helmet, you can buy one off the auction house that's expert equivalent. That has 53 hit. So the golden number you're looking for on all of your items in those slots that I just mentioned is 53 hit. You want an item with 53 hit in each of those slots. Now, for the head and rings, it's fairly easy to get. You can just buy that off the auction house. Extremely simple and straightforward. Now, for the neck, in experts, a ton of different necks drop, and you'll usually pick up a neck quite fast, either from experts or maybe one with slightly less hit from one of the chronicles. Now, necks aren't too hard to find, but you'll eventually find one if you do some expert dungeons and whatnot. And if failing that, you can actually buy a neck for a fairly affordable price under equipment in the store, and then go to accessories and then highlight neck, and you can buy one of these necks. And then if you upgrade it once, see, they're only sort of like 2,400 infinity stones, and then if you upgrade it once, it will become a 53 hit neck, which will give you enough hit for raiding. Then with the weapons, you have the choice, and this is what I'm going to recommend for the weapons and gloves. Now, some classes, if you have a look on the auction house, you'll have a fairly cheap set of weapons or individual weapon itself, which will grant either 106 hit if it's a two-handed weapon, or 2 lots of 53 hit if it's just a one-handed weapon. However, if you can't find any of those for your classes, you have the option to go into equipment and then go to weapons, and then just take the box entitled Dungeon, and you'll see there are some really affordable weapons here. They're fairly cheap. They're like 2k Imperial Slayers marks. If you play it right with Expert Dungeons and Chronicles, you can be getting more than that a day, essentially. So it's very, very easy to get that amount of marks. So as you can see, there's a variety of weapons. It doesn't matter too much about their stats on them. They're fairly straightforward. So if I was, trying to get into raids, I'd buy a couple of daggers and maybe a bow, and that would be me sorted for my weapons. And then for the gloves, if you go into equipment and then onto armor, and then what do you want to take? You want to take a dungeon. Sorry, I'll just highlight that. And dungeon, and then you'll see there are some very cheap gloves for only 1,700 Imperial Slayers marks. Now, I'm going to do a separate video on Imperial Slayers marks and how to get them, but that's just briefly explaining how to fill all the slots and covering that ground. So that is the kind of entry level requirement. Now, there are a few things you are going to need to be a successful player when you want to raid. Now, one of those things is you're going to need 20,000 health. If you don't have 20,000 health, then you are going to die very, very easily to a lot of mechanics in Tier 1. There are some mechanics, for example, like Crucia's Orbital Strike, Matriarch of Pestilence's General AoE, and Big Doom, and Regulos's General Attacks and Frontal Cleave, that are really going to sort of one-shot you, and there's no way to avoid these, so you're going to want to have 20,000 health. Now, you can get this through a variety of additional sources. One of the, two of the best sources that I'm going to recommend are endurance enchants on your boots, your gloves, and also possibly your chest, depending on your circumstances. So, yeah, endurance is all about where it's at, essentially. So, I'm going to go on to explain why DPS isn't important, but before that I'm just going to remind you guys that the planar achievement tree, if you're a new geared player and you're lusting after getting into raids, pour all of your points into endurance, because you're really going to need it when it comes to bosses like Regulos, and it is something you need over DPS, because essentially no matter how much DPS you're doing, it's completely irrelevant if you're dying all the time and getting one shot, so you want to bear that in mind. Now, moving on to DPS. DPS timers for Tier 1 raids are completely invalid. Like, there's the specs and your gear in general has been buffed so much that even a freshly geared bunch of level 60s could meet the enrage timers on pretty much every boss. It is ridiculously easy. The only thing that will really hold players and groups back is players who haven't looked up their specs, who haven't done their research, and also, don't know the fights very well and aren't very comfortable in them. So my advice to you as a new player, literally 400 hit, 20,000 health, and consumables, so weapon enchants and vials is all you need to enter raids. Look up your specs. So for example, if you're a DPS, you're going to want to have a ranged DPS spec and also a melee DPS spec. You want to find out which specs are the best for your class. I'm going to save you the trouble here. If you're a rogue, you want to have ranger and marksman for ranged, and also assassin for melee. If you're a mage, you want to have pyromancer, pyroarchon, and warlock for ranged, and 61 harbinger for melee. If you're a warrior, you want to have tempest for ranged and paragon for melee, and if you're a cleric, you want to have inquisitor for ranged and shaman for melee. Fairly straightforward, guys. Go look up the specs. If you want to really wow and impress people, get those specs, master them. They're pretty damn easy after spending about 10-15 minutes in front of the dummy, and you should have no problem. You can get to grips with them, you can get very savvy, and you can impress raid leaders. And that's what you really need. A good knowledge of the specs and also a good knowledge of the fights to burst into the raiding scene. Now that kind of comes to my second point. If you want to be prepared for Tier 1 raiding, you need to take the 5-10 minutes to look up boss strats. Just watch a quick kill video, read some tactics, you know, while you're sitting on the loo in your lunch break. Really get the fights embedded in your head. So hopefully this kind of guidance will allow you to be confident when approaching pug raid leaders or guilds recruiting for tier 1 raids. What I love personally as a pug raid leader and organizer is brutal honesty. I love it when somebody whispers me, maybe I'll be doing a Frozen Tempest run, and everybody nowadays is all about achievements. They're like, link achievement, so I will naturally follow this, right? But when somebody has the sheer guts to come to me and say, look, I don't have the achievement, but I've dinged level 60 maybe a week or so ago. I've got the hit requirements, I've got the health requirements, I have looked up my specs, and I've looked up all the boss tactics. Dude, I'm begging you, please give me a chance, then I will happily consider them for a spot, you know? Usually I like to take 1 or 2 of these ambitious people, because really you don't need a full raid in tier 1 if you're pugging. It is stupidly easy to overpower the raids at the moment. So I am a good pug leader, will see that ambition in a person, the fact that they've looked up their specs, they know their shit, and they also know the fights, even if it's in theory, you know, you can explain the general stuff and give them a few hints and tips on what not to do while you're actually there. But regardless of which, it still stands. If you approach a raid leader with that ambition, the fact that you've put effort into the game and that you've looked up this shit, they're going to be impressed. I would invite you, so would pretty much, you know, anybody else in their right mind. If somebody isn't willing to give you a chance, despite the fact that you've put in all this effort with your specs, gear, looking at, you know, making sure everything is in order, then, you know, they're just not worth it, and their pug run is generally going to be pretty crappy anyway if they're just inviting people that with the achievement. I know tons of people that have achievements of tier 1 raids and they suck massive amounts of ass. It's really about the player and not about... It's really easy to carry people through, so achievements to me, they don't matter. What matters is the player. So show that to pug raid leaders when you whisper them. Don't just say, oh, I haven't got an achievement, can I invite anyway, I'll be good. Just, you know, send them a short message saying, I've looked up all this shit, I know my shit, invite me. So that's pretty much it, guys, for the kind of guide in how to break into raiding. You don't need any sort of certain set stats like 2000 dexterity or 3000 attack power or just anything irrelevant like that. You need the basics and you can gear up from there. So to finally recap, the basics are 400 hit, 20,000 health, ideally self buffs. It can be a tad lower than that, in all honesty. You want to aim for sort of a 21k raid buff though. You also want to have knowledge of your specs. You want to have a range spec and a melee spec that are decent. You don't want to make up your own shit or you're going to have a bad time and leave a bad impression. And finally, you're going to want to have knowledge of tactics. So that's it for the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a thing or two about getting into the tier 1 raiding scene. If you have any questions at all, do let me know and I will be sure to help when I can. Take care, guys.